So sorry for the interruption. I think we'll just continue from where we left. That is, if the serum cobalamin levels are no, so we are actually gone in patients with pernicious anemia where there is clinical symptoms, and then the serum cobalamin levels were less, and then we treated them when we checked the intrinsic factor antibody. But in either case, if even if the antibody was present or not, we went along with lifelong treatment. So that is, if they are deficient and they have the clinical history, then of course it's a lifelong treatment. Testing for intrinsic factor antibody only just classifies them into antibody positive or antibody negative. So then if they have those and lifelong treatment only merits if they are positive. With intrinsic factor negative, we'd only give lifelong treatment as long as they are showing response. Now, if there is a strong suspicion, if there is strong suspicion of deficiency, but the antibody levels are like in the normal range, then we'll go for it. Then we'll also check an intrinsic factor antibody and also check methylmalonic acid and homocysteine. But only those who have this elevated level of homocysteine and methylmalonic acid and reduced holotranscobalamin, they would be tested. They would be given lifelong therapy. Whereas those who do not have would unlikely to be cobalamin deficient, but therapy can still be considered if they are responding clinically. So this was regarding those who had the suspicion and the strong suspicion with all the features. So if clinical history is there, even if you have a low test, basically you are going to go for low serum cobalamin would still be giving lifelong treatment with the normal range of serum cobalamin. Even after testing, testing would only differentiate them into those who need lifelong or who may do not need therapy. So for those with and now we come to the other part of the spectrum where the patient who have non-specific symptoms, that is not specific symptoms for cobalamin, that they clinically they have do not have the symptoms for cobalamin deficiency, but biochemical features suggest that the levels are either less than 110. So these are those patients who for whom we'll be the clinical features are unlikely, but we are still testing them for serum cobalamin. And if the levels come out to be less than 110 picomole or less than 150, then we are going to follow the same algorithm as for patients who have these clinical symptoms and who have the serum cobalamin levels low. But for patients who do not have the symptoms, the classical or who just have non-specific symptoms and not the classical symptoms of paresthesias and numbness and oral and glossitis. But if their serum cobalamin levels are also like borderline, clinically subclinical borderline state, then those patients have a repeat serum cobalamin after 1 to 2 months. And if it is reduced, then if it is in the normal range, no further testing. If it is reduced, then we will proceed with the intrinsic factor antibody, and then consider oral low dose oral. So these are those who are not clinically are also not so, suspected of cobalamin deficiency, and biochemical parameters are also like borderline. So for them, we can only just give a low dose oral cobalamin for 4 weeks and check after 4 months. And if the intrinsic factor antibody which we had sent earlier is positive, then treat as pernicious anemia. But if it is negative, then we can continue with we can either have a repeat serum cobalamin test, which so like serum cobalamin would again be tested in those patients. If we had first a 2 months break within the first test, and then if there was persistent reduced cobalamin, we then gave the trial of oral cobalamin and along with the intrinsic factor antibody. But if the intrinsic factor antibody is negative, so we again repeat the serum cobalamin because we had given the oral cobalamin, and we check for response. If the serum cobalamin levels are improving, then no further investigation needs to be done. Consider lifelong low dose cobalamin as for as there could be only just food malabsorption and as clinically indicated. But if the serum cobalamin levels are still in the borderline range, then we need to check for methylmalonic acid and homocysteine levels also, and to confirm biochemical deficiency. And they may be treated as antibody negative pernicious anemia. So if the symptoms are not there and on repeat testing they still have reduced levels, on first repeat testing also reduced levels, and on second repeat testing also reduced levels, then only we are going to consider them for we going to confirm, even then we're going to confirm them with the methylmalonic acid and homocysteine, and then consider therapy for pernicious antibody negative pernicious anemia if the levels are still in the borderline range. So we have actually given them a trial of low dose oral cobalamin, and then tested them again for cobalamin levels. If even then their values are in the low negative range, then we are considering them for cobalamin replacement. And we have to remember that these are those patients who had clinically non-specific symptoms. So clinically non-specific symptoms we first repeat after 1 to 2 months. If they are clinically non-specific symptoms and serum cobalamin is reduced, we will repeat after 1 to 2 months. And if it is persistently reduced, then we will give low dose oral cobalamin. If the and check so we'll give low dose cobalamin, oral cobalamin, and check intrinsic factor levels. If the intrinsic factor levels are negative, but and still the repeat serum cobalamin levels are still in the like sub low range, because here also we checked we checked the reduced cobalamin levels, and then checked the and then went on to check the intrinsic factor antibody. Now the intrinsic factor antibody levels are negative, and the repeat serum cobalamin levels are still in the borderline stage. So then we will check for methyl malonic acid homocysteine, and then to confirm the biochemical deficiency, and if positive, we may treat them as antibody negative pernicious anemia patients. So it's basically we had their serum cobalamin tested at 3 stages, even though they were asymptomatic. We checked their serum cobalamin and found it to be in the borderline deficiency state, and then we repeated after 1 to 2 months, and then this um, again on persistent reduced serum cobalamin, we gave them low dose oral cobalamin. So in the next time when we again repeated and still it was in the low normal range, we will still continue to give them cobalamin. And in fact, we may uh, start with the intramuscular. So we may switch them from low dose oral to perhaps high dose oral, or perhaps even intramuscular cobalamin. So any patient, I think, for whom we have a single value of cobalamin deficiency also, this algorithm could also be followed for those cases. That is, we can consider that they either first of all repeat testing, and then also starting with low dose therapy, and uh, repeat testing again. And if these consistently repeatedly the values are in the borderline 110 to 148 picomole per liter, then we can consider them switching them from low dose to high dose oral cobalamin, or in fact even methyl cobalamin, and to be treated as antibody negative pernicious anemia. This is all, I think, just a repetition, because in most they have mentioned that the patients with the low serum cobalamin of unknown significance, they lack specific symptoms. And even in this group, there are two sub groups of patients, those with biochemical evidence and those with none. So in those where repeat testing still falls within the subclinical range, a blood sample may be taken for anti-intrinsic factor antibodies, and a short trial of empirical oral cyanocobalamin 40 microgram daily for 4 weeks should be given while awaiting results of the intrinsic factor antibody test, with instructions to the patient to report immediately if symptoms of neuropathy develop, as this dose would be inadequate for a true pernicious anemia. So the short course of cobalamin, so basically they can be given low dose and then asked to report immediately if symptoms of neuropathy develop, as this dose would be inadequate for a true pernicious anemia. Now, the short course of cobalamin may be of benefit because the elderly have a high incidence of food malabsorption, with some early studies suggesting a possible cognitive improvement after cobalamin supplements with or without folate B vitamins. So, in case of a positive intrinsic factor antibody, the further management is lifelong therapy. In those negative for this, a further serum cobalamin level assessment is recommended after 4 months. And if the level is well within the reference, then food malabsorption is a strong possibility and the patient should be managed accordingly. If still within the subclinical range, then consider investigation of methylmalonic acid and total homocysteine to confirm biochemical deficiency and manage as antibody negative pernicious anemia. So, in patients with the reduced serum cobalamin and normal total homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, no further action is required, as a normal total homocysteine and methylmalonic acid and total homocysteine indicate the absence of a cobalamin deficient state. So basically, if the methylmalonic acid and homocysteine are normal, then they will indicate an absence of a cobalamin deficient state. So in patients with reduced cobalamin but normal total homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, no further action is required. And some patients with paraproteins may have low serum cobalamin with normal methylmalonic acid and homocysteine, which on treatment of an underlying myeloma will return to normal. So, suggesting the initial low value due to SA interference. We had mentioned this earlier as well, that there could be that this repeatedly low value which is coming of cobalamin, it may be either we give them we repeat testing for so we repeat testing of these patients on the third instance. If they have like a repeatedly low value, then we'll check methylmalonic acid and homocysteine to confirm biochemical deficiency. Now, these may need treatment. However, if these values come out to be negative, then this is a highly unlikely that they have cobalamin deficiency. So, we may not need further testing. We may just give them this uh, trial of cobalamin and as symptomatic improvement is there or not. But if the values but they have suggested that we also need to take into consideration the fact that this persistently low or normal cobalamin level could be due to SC interference due to paraprotein. So underlying multiple myeloma may also be there, and um, so this may also need to be ruled out in patients with serum cobalamin levels of subclinical deficiency on 2 occasions. An empirical trial of treatment with oral cyanocobalamin should be given. So after two, so we had basically had 3 values of squalene. After two, we did give an empirical trial of oral 50 microgram daily for 4 weeks cobalamin, and strict instructions should be given to patients to seek immediate medical attention if symptoms of neuropathy develop, and the cobalamin level should be checked after 3 months, and second line test considered if there is no improvement. And use of metformin in type 2 diabetes is associated with reduced serum cobalamin levels and related to dose and duration of treatment. The mechanism is unknown, but malabsorption may be one factor. So it may be alleviated by increased intake of calcium. So basically, what they have suggested here is that this metformin we had gone through earlier, that this causes a decreased absorption of the cobalamin, and it sort of induces a state of B12 deficiency. So related also to the dose and duration of treatment. So patients who are long term on high dose metformin. So not all patients taking metformin develop this, but those on a long term high dose treatment therapy with metformin, those type 2 diabetics, they due to unknown mechanisms, they do develop this malabsorption of B12, and they symptoms may be elevated by increased intake of calcium. So this is also something that we can advise those patients who have this low level of B12 and associated neuropathy. So they can be shifted to high dose therapy of cobalamin, and advised to, and also increase the intake of calcium. And biochemical evidence and also repeat testing would also be necessary to check for the response to cobalamin therapy. And also I think there was another instance in which okay, so they just need repeat testing. Mm, and then just increased intake of calcium. And also yes, not only just repeat testing after 3 months, but they should be also advised to report immediately in between that follow up period if their neurological symptoms worsen, or uh, uh, this is also something that we can give them an empirical trial of low dose, but they should, if the low dose is, they are started on low dose, then they should be asked to seek immediate medical attention if their neuropathy worsens. However, still, we can start them on high dose even if their say levels are less than 148 microgram picomole per liter, or that is the 150 nanogram per liter. So then we may then advise them to increase the calcium intake as well. And biochemical evidence of cobalamin deficiency with metformin use has also been shown with no resultant clinical impact. In contrast, precipitation and progression of peripheral neuropathy has been reported. So more recently, it has been suggested that despite a low serum cobalamin, the intracellular cobalamin metabolism is improved in patients taking metformin. So although metformin actually uh, interferes with the absorption part of it, but they have suggested that in contrast, it has been suggested that despite a low serum cobalamin, the intracellular cobalamin metabolism is improved in patients taking metformin. So I think this is like the management dilemmas are similar to those of subclinical deficiency, and short empirical treatment should be considered in the presence of strong clinical suspicion of deficiency to prevent onset or progression of peripheral neuropathy. So, no definitive advice can be given on the desirable frequency of monitoring of serum cobalamin in patients with type 2 diabetes or metformin therapy, but it is recommended that serum cobalamin is checked in the presence of a strong clinical suspicion of deficiency. So, if there is a clinical suspicion of deficiency, serum cobalamin levels should be checked, and if they are reduced, the patient should have tests for anti-intrinsic factor antibody, because the concurrence of pernicious anemia with diabetes should be considered. Okay, so this is also an important hint that we have, that those patients, even the if those type 2 diabetics who are on metformin therapy, they should be if the serum cobalamin levels are low, even they should have their anti-intrinsic factor antibodies done because of concurrence of pernicious anemia with diabetes. And if positive, the patient should have lifelong treatment with replacement cobalamin. If negative, the reduced level may be purely as a result of metformin, although underlying antibody negative pernicious anemia cannot be excluded. So treatment with oral cobalamin may be considered 50 microgram for 1 month, and subsequent monitoring of serum cobalamin after 6 months and then at yearly intervals is suggested. So currently, no recommendations can be given on prophylactic administration of oral cobalamin in patients taking metformin. Okay, so no recommendations on prophylactic administration on patients taking metformin, but patients with metformin who do develop the clinical symptoms of peripheral neuropathy, it is recommended that you do test their serum cobalamin levels. And if the serum cobalamin levels are reduced, then we should also test their anti-intrinsic factor antibody because of the association of pernicious anemia with diabetes. Um, and and if the antibody levels are positive, the patient of course is on lifelong treatment. If negative, the reduced levels may be purely as a result of the metformin drug induced. And although of course an underlying antibody negative pernicious anemia cannot be excluded. And for these patients, treatment with the oral cobalamin 50 microgram for 1 month with subsequent monitoring of serum cobalamin after 6 months and then at yearly intervals is suggested. So for 1 month, if we are giving them low dose oral cobalamin, and I think we can if of course they respond to this, their neuropathy responds to this treatment for 1 month. I think we can even go on to um, continue them on either we can continue the therapy or continue to monitor their serum cobalamin levels. I think this is what they have tried to mention here. For those who are
But
negative
ma'am,
yes.
this monitoring of 6 months and yearly interval, they are talking about the diabetic patient with low cobalamin. For that patient, we will follow up that,
Yes, because they had mentioned that if the level is reduced, and then they are testing for intrinsic factor antibody, and if the intrinsic factor antibody is negative, then they are treating them with oral cobalamin based on the assumption that they are antibody negative. They could be antibody negative pernicious anemia. They haven't actually excluded because therapy will still be given. Okay, so if they are positive, then of course this lifelong treatment. If they are negative, then even then we have to give them treatment with oral cobalamin. But what I'm trying to think is that what I'm just trying to figure out is if it's 50 microgram for 1 month, then do we stop the dose for 1 month and just subsequently just monitor their serum levels, or if they are symptomatic, I think we should continue giving them until their symptoms improve, the neuropathy improves.
yes. It's again the trial. They
I
are
think they
going towards, yes, they are going towards a trial. Like on trial basis, we are going towards the diagnosis. Like it is because of the metformin, or it is for the antibody negative pernicious anemia.
yeah, so then we can give them this low dose oral cobalamin and then
So
test their
metformin, then this low dose can improve that. But if still it is because of the antibody negative pernicious anemia, the symptoms will come back. I think so.
yes. That is why I guess so. You are trying to say that if on monitoring the levels they come out to be reduced, then we will again follow the algorithm for like pernicious anemia. That is it's antibody negative pernicious anemia, but we need to consider lifelong therapy in them also. Actually, what I think is that if we give them 50 microgram for 1 month, and their symptoms improve, and then if you stop the therapy and we just monitor the serum cobalamin levels, if the serum cobalamin levels start to fall, this would actually show that it is because of metformin induced malabsorption, because they would still be taking that metformin. However, if their levels um, are because of I think in the other case the levels would fall if they come off therapy. And so I don't actually get what they mean by 50 microgram for 1 month. um, I think this is also this is just for the neuropathy part, that if they have those symptoms, if they have the clinical symptoms and the serum cobalamin levels are checked, and the intrinsic factor antibody is negative, then we give them this therapy for 1 month, this 50 microgram for 1 month, and then subsequently monitor their serum cobalamin levels. Because what they mentioned in the third point is that prophylactic administration of oral cobalamin on patients who are taking metformin is not there. So if the level is low, but if the serum cobalamin is low, but the symptomatically the patient is improving, then we after 1 month of therapy, if patient has improved, we do not still keep on giving the oral cobalamin in patients taking metformin,
Yes.
just as prophylaxis for preventing neuropathy.
Yes, we will continue with the monitoring, but not with the prophylaxis part. We will not continue with the dose.
Yes, because I think those subclinical deficiency patients, they would of course require strict monitoring, and and we just keep on checking their cobalamin levels. This is something that needs to be done. But as I mentioned, that no definitive advice can be given on the desired frequency of follow-up in patients on metformin. So for, and also for patients on so we have like those risk group patients, those with the diabetes associated, and those who are taking hormone replacement therapy and oral contraceptive pills. And these patients may not be significant when the reduction in serum cobalamin may not be significant when using low dose oral contraceptive, for example 20 microgram ethinyl estradiol. The effect of hormone replacement therapy is not conclusive, given that both a reduction of cobalamin and no significant effect on cobalamin levels have been reported. However, a cross-sectional study of young women taking oral contraceptive did not show any biochemical evidence of impaired cobalamin status, despite a reduction of serum cobalamin and holotranscobalamin of up to 25%. So patients on taking oral contraceptives, these also have this, as we had read earlier, that metformin actually causes an disruption of the malabsorption part. Although they had suggested that intracellular metabolism might be improved. Now this HRT therapy, what this has effect is that it impairs the and this also impairs the absorption part because it allows it to be remain bound to food. So food bound cobalamin malabsorption occurs. So in those patients who are on oral contraceptives, so they may have serum cobalamin and holotranscobalamin level um, reduced up to 25%. So and but they may not show any effect on the same study did not show any effect of HRT on serum cobalamin, holotranscobalamin, or metabolic status, metabolic markers. Um, so actually, what they're trying to say that hormone replacement therapy effect is, although it is significantly there in those who have this deficiency, it may be up to 25%, but it does not occur in all patients. So the effect of HRT is not conclusive, given that both a reduction of cobalamin and no significant effect on cobalamin levels have been reported. That is, patients may have a significant may have a reduction and may not have a reduction. So this correlation between HRT and cobalamin malabsorption is not documented, is not conclusive. The testing of serum cobalamin is suggested only in the presence of strong clinical suspicion of deficiency, because the interpretation of results can be challenging. So with diabetics, with metformin, they had not actually referred to it as being they had mentioned that the mechanism is unknown how it affects the absorption, but the association with the reduced serum cobalamin levels is documented, and it is related to dose and duration of treatment. But with HRT, the association between the use of HRT and reduction in serum cobalamin, this is not documented. There have been studies that have showed reduction of up to 25% even in patients who are taking oral contraceptives and have a reduced cobalamin status. But also there is like a considerable number of patients who do not show significant effect on cobalamin levels. So only if the patient is symptomatic, then and on HRT, then their serum cobalamin levels are done. And if they are mildly reduced, that is 110 to 148 picomole per liter, they do not require further investigation, but should be advised to review their dietary intake of cobalamin rich foods, and cobalamin supplements may be considered. So basically, they are not investigated further because diabetics, they are still investigated for pernicious anemia, because diabetics, if they have clinically strong suspicion, then they are investigated for pernicious anemia, and anti-intrinsic factor antibodies are done because of the strong association of diabetes with pernicious anemia. But hormone replacement therapy patients, women on HRT and on oral contraceptive pills, although the association is weak, so firstly, no prophylactic cobalamin is given, and then if they develop symptoms, then and their serum cobalamin levels is mildly reduced, then they do not require further investigation, but they should be just advise supplements of cobalamin with food and or with the oral pharmacological preparations of cobalamin supplementation. And then the effect of pregnancy also. So I think they will come across this time limit again. So we'll just go through this part, and then probably we'll consider this folate therapy deficiency, and the remainder part, if it's some is left, and folate deficiency, we'll inshallah do tomorrow, because uh, there's just these are things that I actually went through this briefly yesterday as well. Most of the things we have discussed yesterday when we were going into detail about the causes of cobalamin, that is in pregnancy there is lowering of serum cobalamin levels, and it falls by 30% in third trimester, and then holotranscobalamin levels has been shown to remain unchanged, suggesting that this is a better test to assess the cobalamin status in pregnancy. We had gone through this earlier as well. So serum cobalamin levels 110 to 148 in pregnancy may be physiological, and other biochemical tests to determine. So basically, much of it is physiological, since about 30% fall can occur by third trimester. So 30% by third trimester, and is physiological. And the if it is in the 110 to 148 range, mild, it may be physiological. If it is even less than this, then holotranscobalamin levels are a better indicator of cobalamin. If a low cobalamin result has been found in the presence of negative anti-intrinsic factor antibodies, but with strong clinical suspicion of deficiency. So, in order to limit the extensive investigation and resultant anxiety, 3 injections of hydroxycobalamin are suggested to cover the pregnancy. And cobalamin status check 2 months postpartum. So this is like for pregnancy, that is only those with strong suspicion should have a short course of empirical therapy, that is 3 injections, so three intramuscular injections of hydroxycobalamin to cover the pregnancy. And holotranscobalamin may be more reliable than serum cobalamin in determining deficiency in pregnancy, and is recommended as a test of choice if available. So vegetarians also, they have strict vegetarians, they are to be considered for monitoring dietary alterations. However, for them, dietary alteration and supplements may just be given, particularly during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And also those with the poor absorption due to, so these are those mild cobalamin deficient people, like those with pregnancy who develop the mild deficiency in the third trimester. And the vegans who develop this deficiency are basically all these people are not investigated further. Poor absorption, those with poor absorption due to gastric surgery, we know that if they had had a gastric surgery, this is most likely the cause of um, the intrinsic factor deficiency. So oral treatment may not be adequate, and lifelong compliance may be poor, and therefore recommendation of prevention treatment of nutritional deficiency indicate monitoring of level and prophylactic supplementation. So those with gastric bypass, actually they are those with bariatric surgery, they should have their cobalamin status monitored and likely to need cobalamin supplementation via a route depending upon the type of surgery. So if they've had a gastric resection, so intrinsic factor would not of course be released, and it would not bind. So depending on the type of surgery, if it's a superficial surgery, then of course the stomach and ileum are spared. So then of course they may be supplemented, depending on the type of surgery, whether it was just a resection or some bypass procedure. So then the supplementation would depend upon that. And patients with food bound cobalamin malabsorption may benefit from low dose oral replacement. So food-bound malabsorption has been used to describe a group of disorders characterized by gastric hypochlorhydria due to age-related gastric atrophy, or secondary to drugs such as proton pump inhibitors. In such conditions, the cobalamin may not be present separated from food, and therefore is unavailable to intrinsic factor. So in all these patients as well, and those with the um, uh, just low dose oral replacement is required. And patients with exocrine disease, they result in failure of release of cobalamin from hepatocorrin in the duodenum, resulting in cobalamin deficiency. So either the cobalamin is not released from the food by in in patients with gastric atrophy or secondary to proton pump inhibitors, or either there is pancreatic disease which prevents the release of cobalamin from hepatocorrin in the duodenum. So this is relatively rare, and no specific recommendations are given for this exocrine disease. But for food-bound cobalamin, when low dose oral replacement is advised. And in infancy, for those with those genetic disorders, true cobalamin deficiency with the significant clinical problems is considered to be rare. Although we had discussed those patients with intrinsic factor deficiency or abnormality and intrinsic factor receptor deficiency or abnormality, and in those patients, reduced cobalamin levels in infancy should be treated promptly to prevent the long-term neurological sequelae. And in the presence of clinical suspicion of underlying cobalamin deficiency, even in the presence of normal serum cobalamin levels, if there is a suspicion, even the further biochemical tests, including methylmalonic acid and and total homocysteine, are recommended, and the role of holotranscobalamin in this context is undefined. Further investigation to define any possible genetic abnormalities should be referred to a specialist center. So there are genetic abnormalities. Basically, if the mother is had been deficient, and the child presents within about 3 to 6 months of with deficiency, then further biochemical testing with methylmalonic acid, and if there's normal serum cobalamin levels, we need to go for further biochemical tests, including methylmalonic acid and total homocysteine, and it should be treated promptly, in fact, even if the symptoms are there. But for genetic testing, we may refer them to a specialist center. No specific recommendations can currently be made in the relation to breastfeeding associated biochemical low cobalamin status. So I think we'd gone into much detail about the hereditary causes earlier also, that the patient may present as early as 1 to 3 months or later as 12 to 18 months when cobalamin stores are exhausted. And then as serum cobalamin levels may be within reference limit in a number of cases. So we have to test for intracellular cobalamin deficiency with methylmalonic acid and total homocysteine. And treating of inborn errors of cobalamin metabolism is with intramuscular cobalamin. So those patients who do present with the cobalamin deficiency, we give them intramuscular, and we have to actually prevent this neurological deficit. And in conditions with hyperhomocysteinemia, betaine can be given to, it can be added to cobalamin supplementation. And those with methylmalonic acid urea, so if the homocysteine level is increased, then betaine is added. And with those with methylmalonic acid urea, where there is methylmalonic acidemia, there would be a total protein or methionine restriction can be given, and carnitine supplementation. So betaine is given with cobalamin for those with hyperhomocysteinemia. Um, those with hyperhomocysteinemia, betaine is added. And in those with methylmalonic acid, so if homocysteine levels are elevated, betaine is added. If methylmalonic acid levels are added, then we can supplement with carnitine, or we can give methionine and threonine restriction.